We are grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for helping pay for the evaluation of state standards. We are grateful to all of you for being here, and to the worldwide audience. Let me say that this is being webcast, and we are apparently also going to be commented on and back at by Twitter. Everybody under 50 at Fordham uses Twitter regularly. I'm going to admit... That's the age cutoff. 45, actually. I'm going to admit to being a Twitter ignoramus, but I am told to tell everybody watching that the hashtag is SOSSS12. SOSSS12. You can follow the goings-on or comment on the goings-on if you are willing to be distracted from the goings-on by using Twitter. Copies outside of the summary of our new study, as well as other recent Fordham products. I hope everybody's picked up as many of them as they can possibly use. Let me encourage everybody to check out Fordham's gorgeous new website at www.edexcellence.net. Let me tell the studio audience, sorry worldwide audience about this part, a reception will follow in this room with drinks and snacks for those that bestirred themselves to come in person as opposed to virtually. Also let you know that in this series, which we are now calling Fordham Live, all of our actual face-to-face kind of events, the next one will be in Columbus, Ohio on the 15th of February, as we will be talking about the implications of the Common Core for the state of Ohio, and it, too, will be webcast at 9:30 in the morning. Even if you're not in Ohio, you might possibly find it interesting. The panelists' biographies are with you, so I'm not going to take time to introduce them. Each of them is going to have 7 minutes for opening comments. Kathleen's going to talk first about the Fordham study of state standards, and then we're going to go down the line in this direction, with Steve talking, among other things, about what they're up to at Achieve in coming up with new alternative science standards, with Dan talking about why kids do or don't learn things in science and other subjects, with Kate talking about the teacher's role in all of this, and with Anne talking about a particularly interesting and promising supplementary program that advances science and STEM education called Project Lead the Way. Unless I've forgotten something essential, I'm going to let you summarize the report rather than me taking people through data from the report. I just want to show you that it's a substantial piece of work. It's a couple hundred pages long. The whole thing is online. You've got the front bit in your in hard copy in the handouts. There's about 4 pages on each state in here of 50. There's also an evaluation of the NAEP science framework, the framework underlying the NAEP science assessment in here that you may want to look at. You may want to look at 1 or 2 of your favorite states to see what our reviewers said about their science standards. I think you'll find it interesting. I'm also going to say this is by far the most colorful cover we have ever put on any Fordham product in the history of Fordham, and I'm colorblind, and even I can see that this is kind of gaudy. It's online, too. So we're going to enforce time limits, panelists, and then we're going to get to conversation. Timekeeper, by my watch, it's 5 after, and we're on schedule. And Kathleen, take it away.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to make sure, with that, it does work very easily. So I have a couple of slides just for some visuals to help as I talk you through some of the findings of our report. Again, it was called the State of State Science Standards. And I sort of wish I could have one of those State of the Union moments where I came in and said the state of our state science standards is strong, to rousing applause and a standing ovation. Unfortunately, quite the opposite is true. The state of our state science standards is actually quite poor. The national average was a C, but just barely a C. We barely eked it out. Before I get into all of the findings, though, I wanted to walk you through a little bit about how we approached the report, beginning with our criteria. Very simply, we graded each state against two categories, content and rigor and clarity and specificity. A state could earn up to 7 points for content and rigor and could earn up to 3 points for clarity and specificity. And we were looking for a couple of different things. First, we wanted to make sure that they covered all of the essential K-12 content that students need to know across all of the domains that we looked at, which I'll talk about in a second. Also, was the content appropriately rigorous at all of the grades? Were the standards free from error? Sorry, thank you.
Out is on. We're
Okay.
on now.
Oh, great. Were the standards free from error, and were they clear and specific enough to actually guide curriculum instruction and assessment? And obviously science is not one domain, but actually a combination of several different domains. So for this report, we actually brought together experts from physical science, physics and chemistry, from earth and space science, and from life science. And we also brought in an expert who looked at what we called scientific inquiry and methodology, which was looking at the science process skills that are so critical to science education. And you'll see on the state report card, which you don't have in front of you, but I have a screenshot of up here. On the state report card, you can see how each state did for each of those domains. And that actually can give you some really interesting information about the state, because the state's average grade can actually often mask some wild variation among the domains. So for example, I pulled out Michigan, which earned a C overall, but got a perfect 7 out of 7 for chemistry, a 1 out of 7 for physics, a 2 out of 7 for inquiry, a 5 out of 7 for life science. So that C really does hide a much more interesting picture, which is that there was variation even among the different domains. And again, we averaged those scores together to get the average content and rigor score. The grades. Again, I said the state of our state science standards is not strong, unfortunately. Only 2 states received straight A's, perfect A's. They were DC and California. Only additional 4 states, Massachusetts, Indiana, South Carolina, and Virginia, earned A minuses. Only 7 states earned grades in the B range, and only New York had the sole B plus, and the other 6 were Bs. And then 27 states earned Ds and Fs. So more than half of the states earned grades in the D and F range. Also, the other thing that Checker mentioned that we looked at was the NAEP assessment framework, and the NAEP assessment framework actually fared quite well. It also received an A minus, so it too can be looked to as a model for what K-12 science standards can and should look like. This is not the first time that we've looked at state science standards. It's the third. The most recent time before this was 2005. Now, before I go into too much detail about the changes between 2005 and today, it's worth noting that the comparisons between last time and this time are imperfect, because we did change the criteria fairly substantially. We think we made them better. And you can actually look in the Appendix A of the report, details our criteria and our rubrics that we used, but they are different. But even though they're different, I think comparisons still tell an interesting story, particularly in a couple of cases. 44 jurisdictions have actually changed their standards since 2005. And of those, we have some good news. 11 changed them and made them better, including Washington, D.C., which went from a mediocre C to now a best-in-class A. Again, it's one of the only 2 states that earned an A. Kansas went from an F to a B. Arkansas from a D to a B. And Mississippi and Texas from an F to a C. Unfortunately, as is often the case, the news can't all be good. There were 16 states who changed their standards and who saw their grades drop between 2005 and 2012, including Colorado, New Jersey, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia, whose grade dropped from a B to a D. Finally, there are some common missteps. I mean, while each state has a unique picture and it's worth diving into your favorite states, as Checker said, there are some areas where a lot of states encountered the same missteps over and over again. The first one was many states continue to undermine evolution. Our life science reviewer did note that the evolution coverage across states is actually slightly better than it was in 2005, but there still are a lot of states who are undermining evolution by either dancing around it. There are some states that still don't use the term evolution, substituting other euphemisms in its place. There are states who encourage students to study the strengths and weaknesses of evolution without ever giving the important content that the students need to learn in a really forthright way. And all but 4 states actually dodge human evolution entirely. There are only 4 states, Florida, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Iowa, who openly embrace it. In addition to undermining evolution, many states include standards that are so vague that they are virtually meaningless. They just could not possibly guide curriculum instruction and assessment the way standards need to. In addition, something I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later, process standards are critical. They need to be integrated with content, and too many states fail to make that critical connection. And finally, far too many states fail to make the critical link between math and science, particularly at the upper grades.
Good job. On time, informative, and grateful. We are grateful. So, Stephen, your job is to clean up after the elephant.
You know, that's kind of an accurate way to put. That's a pretty accurate way to put that, Checker. My job is to work with a group of states and a group of writers to develop what we're calling the next generation science standards. Many of you probably know that this started as a 2-step process with the National Research Council developing the framework for K-12 science education. Our job is to now take that framework and working with this group of 26 states who have stepped up to be leads in this and to be partners in this, and work with a group of writers to take that framework and then move it over to student expectations. If you've read the framework, you'll see that it reads much like the National Science Education Standards or Benchmarks for Science Literacy, where it talks about the concepts, but it doesn't actually talk about how kids are going to be showing the proficiency in classrooms or on assessments. So that's the intellectual lift for us, is to take that framework and then turn it into something that is going to be useful, clear, have rich content that can really inform classroom instruction and assessment. The way the framework lays out the vision is that there are 3 dimensions of science education. There's the content, which is always has to be very rich. Science and engineering practice, which is really how we think about the world, how we problem solve, and cross-cutting concepts, which are the connective tissue that really bring together the ideas from across the various disciplines. So we are at this time working very hard on developing a first draft. We are planning on releasing that draft, we hope in late March or early April, and that will be a public draft for everybody in the world to comment on. So in looking at the report, the 4 items that Kathleen pointed out are things that are very high on our mind as we're developing these standards. Obviously, the framework being led by the NRC gives us a great deal of authority, and it gives states a great deal of authority with regard to the teaching of evolution. It's very clear in that document that evolution should not be removed and it should not be watered down in any way. We are very focused on clarity. We're taking many steps, and when you see the public draft, I hope that you'll see that there have been a lot of steps taken, maybe in some cases to overstate things so that it's very clear what teachers and kids are going to be responsible for. The integration of the science and engineering practices are going to be very important. We know that inquiry for the sake of inquiry's sake, when kids are just doing things, it does not really lead a child toward being able to actually do anything with it. That only through using science and engineering practices through the context of content does that begin to make sense. And finally, with mathematics, we are taking very deliberate steps, including connecting directly to the Common Core State Standards in math. When you see a standard in the Next Generation Science Standards, it will be very clearly linked to the math standard, as well as in the language of the standard itself. We're going to be very clear about the math that kids are responsible for. So we're very happy and actually look forward to arranging a time for you to come and talk to the writers and to the states about your findings, and we feel like it's going to be very helpful for us in our work going forward.
I think that scheduling is in the works, I believe.
It is.
Let me just add that, as Stephen mentioned, that the NRC Framework is sort of what their starting point. And when that came out a few months ago, one of our senior science reviewers, Paul Gross, did an evaluation of the NRC Framework, which is on our website, if you're interested, and graded it at a B+, and said basically the content is here, but there are some things that the standards writers need to watch out for as they try to translate this framework into standards. So if you're interested in that sort of intervening step, at least from our standpoint, between the NRC and Stephen's project at Achieve, and you've got how many states with you now?
26.
26 states are participating in the development process. Is that right? Okay. Just to say that the Paul Gross review of the NRC framework is available too. So, Dan, you've been devoted yourself in recent years to why kids do and don't learn things. Help us.
Boy, that's a terrible introduction, Checker. Checker
Did
said,
you rather clean up after another element?
Yeah, I don't know. Why am I here? Right, so I'm a cognitive scientist by training, and am interested in what happens in classrooms and why kids learn and don't learn things. So what in 7 minutes, I'm going to try and describe for you what I see as two significant challenges to improvement in classroom performance in science education, and then three more hopeful factors, things that we might do a little bit better. The first challenge is that in terms of our knowledge about how kids learn to think scientifically and how they learn scientific content, we're not as far along as we are in other domains. There is more research and more funding for studying reading and for studying mathematics, and I think our knowledge, it's not that we don't know anything about how kids learn to reason scientifically, but we're not as far along as we are in those domains. The second challenge is that we've set, in one sense, a sort of an extra challenge in science education, because we not only want kids to acquire knowledge and skills to use that knowledge, we also want them to understand how experts generate new knowledge. So we want them to understand the method by which new knowledge is created. We want kids to know math, but we don't necessarily want them to know how mathematicians go about discovering new mathematical knowledge. We want that in science. So that's a second significant challenge, I think. Let me offer, despite what I said, is a knowledge base that's not as rich as it is in some areas, three observations of things we could probably do fairly rapidly. They're not easy necessarily to implement, but they're things that we have pretty good sense would probably help. The first is having teachers who know more science, and I have a feeling Kate is going to talk about this factor. In general, having a teacher who has an advanced degree doesn't help kids learn more. It's not a big boost. The exception is teachers who have an advanced degree in math or science, and especially for kids who are in high school. But the latest data show that about 30% of chemistry teachers and physics teachers did not major in chemistry or physics, and in fact are not certified to teach the subject matter that they're teaching. That's setting aside the rigor of the certification process, which varies a good deal, and in some states is probably not all that rigorous. For middle school science, the figures are much worse. The percentage of kids who are being taught science by someone who has a deep background in science is pretty minimal. This is especially pertinent on this question that we're talking about today in terms of the report of standards. One thing that I find frequently gets confused is the difference between standards and a curriculum. Standards is not the same thing as a curriculum. Standards tells you what the goal is, does not tell you how to get to the goal. Right? So standards are sort of necessary but not sufficient. So what happens in the absence of a strong curriculum? Well, you're putting more onus on the district or the school or quite possibly the individual teacher to come up with the curriculum on their own. And so if you've got a teacher who does not have a rich background knowledge in chemistry and you're asking them to essentially come up with their own curriculum, that is asking a great deal of that teacher. Second thing, so that's the first thing we could do is if we had teachers who had a richer background in science, I think we could expect better outcomes. Second thing we could do is put more time on task. This is incredibly obvious, right? This is something psychologists have figured out. If you study something more, you get better at it. We're very proud of that. Kids are spending very, very little time on science. The best data that I know of are pretty old now, but they're really good observational data. About 4% of instructional time for first graders is on science. In third grade, it's about 5% of instructional time. In most districts, science just does not get a lot of floor time until at the earliest sixth grade. In many districts, science just isn't taken very seriously until ninth grade. Right? And you can't expect that kids are going to learn a lot of science unless they put some time into it. And there are correlational data showing across international, looking at international data showing that more instructional time does lead to better performance. The final factor is some attention to the emotional aspect of science. Now, this is the data I'm about to tell you is sort of the occasion of humor and probably ought to be. If you look at the PISA results, American kids are pretty well last among industrialized nations. Right? We're really not doing very well at all. But when you look at attitudes towards science, our kids are very upbeat. They like science. And furthermore, they think they're pretty good at it. Okay? Now, in a way, that's funny, but let me tell you about some other data from a colleague of mine, Robert Tye. Consider a really significant problem. A lot of American kids, when they get to college, they declare a major in a scientific field, and then they quit. Why do they quit? Well, the obvious answer is they can't hack it. And to some extent, that's true. Ability matters. But what Tye showed is that the student's commitment to science also matters a lot. So what he looked at was what kids had said in 8th grade they wanted to be doing at age 30. If you take a college freshman who has average ability in science, but in 8th grade said, when I'm 30, I expect to be in a career that requires a scientific degree. That student is much more likely to finish a bachelor's degree in science than a student who is high in scientific ability, but in 8th grade had not intended to complete a bachelor's degree in science, didn't want to end up in that sort of a career. So I think there's a real silver lining here. Again, it seems sort of funny, our kids are terrible at science, but they like it and they think they're good at it. There's actually something that we can mine here. Right now it's being ignored, but attitudes towards science, not empty optimism, but healthy attitudes or positive attitudes towards science is something we should cultivate.
Good job. Thank you very much. So, Kate, you've been focusing in recent years on teacher quality. What do we know about teacher quality that bears on science?
Good. Thank you, and thanks for having me. Obviously our focus is on the teacher part of the equation and what schools need to do to ensure that teachers are much better prepared to deliver the kinds of standards that Achieve is trying to develop. And certainly when we look at why kids are low performing, it's not hard to trace that back to the regulations that states have put in place for what teachers need to know and the lack of standards by the profession itself in terms of what should be taught to prepare a teacher to teach science. There are 1,400 and some schools of education in the United States, and I would wager that there are maybe 1,400 different ways of preparing a science teacher. So there's a great deal of chaos in the profession, and school districts themselves bear some of the responsibility for this, as I will explain. We have done 2 pretty in-depth studies of how teachers are prepared not just to teach science, but to teach most any subject in 2 states, one in Illinois and one in Texas. And in both those states, we learned the interconnectedness or the shared responsibility for the mess we're in. In Texas, for example, They have many states, including Texas, have a sort of a loophole reg or figure out what we do to bring more science teachers in the classroom. So therefore, we'll have something that will serve as a Band-Aid. So they have a general science reg that you can get into the classroom with pretty scant coursework in the 4 disciplines of science. So when we sort of traced how that played out in institutions, even the most respected institutions in the state, including UT Austin, were graduating teachers that were pretty woefully and by any measures unprepared in their in certain subjects. And we actually, when we looked at this problem, we took a great deal of heat for it. How dare we criticize UT Austin? It's one of the most respected programs in the country. They have the How's the U Teach model. And we were told by all sorts of people that if we came out with a report that criticized the way UT Austin prepared teachers, we would lose all credibility. So we went down and had lunch with faculty down there to figure out if there was some sort of disconnect between what we had learned and what they actually did. And basically what we had reported was that they were giving 24 hours of physics to future high school teachers, but letting them also qualify to teach biology or geology on the basis of 2 courses or 8 credits in those fields. So we said, surely you guys are one of the best. What's going on? And they said, well, we have to do this, or school districts wouldn't want to hire our teachers. And I said, well, what do you mean school districts wouldn't want to hire your teachers? Why don't you just make sure your teachers are very well prepared? He said, well, there's not enough room in the schedule to adequately prepare teachers in all 4 disciplines. But even if there were, I'm not sure we could persuade students to do it. So there's a big conundrum. How do you adequately prepare teachers to teach all 4 fields? And but the school districts want to have a teacher that is qualified by the state to teach all 4 subjects. They're not going to hire someone who just went through our physics program. So we know it's bad policy. We know it's bad practice, but we have to deliver teachers to schools. So this is going on at the level of UT Austin with, and I have great respect for them, and I still do. But they clearly feel caught between a rock and a hard place. You can imagine what we found at much less respected institutions around the state. And basically, I will tell you, we mostly saw chaos. One school would prepare middle school teachers to teach biology by requiring 1 biology course, and an institution literally down the road required 9 biology courses for the middle school teacher. So the profession has yet to set any clear standards about what it expects out of teachers and their adequate preparation. Let me close by saying that we have certainly wrestled with this problem, because it's not insignificant, the idea of the expectation of schools across this country that you need to have high school teachers who can teach all 4 sciences. It's a bit unreasonable, but it is an expectation that I think that we have to meet, that we have to change if we're going to solve this problem. You cannot expect high school teachers to have 4 majors in the subject that they teach. So we've come up with some reasonable compromises. At least have 1 complete major in a science, and then have minors in the other topics, the other fields you're going to require. But that is a huge leap for schools to take on, and it's something that we hear from districts that's going to create shortages, and we hear from institutions that they can't possibly find room in their schedules. So this is not easy stuff. Thanks.
So, Ann, you're from New York, and I used to work long ago for the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York, and he was fond of the following anecdote. A man is walking down a street in Manhattan minding his own business, and out of nowhere comes a total stranger who hits him and knocks him down. And the man lying on the ground looks up at his assailant and says, Why did you hit me? I've never tried to help you. You're trying to help, essentially from outside, schools, school districts, educators, people, even parents, I believe, with science. Are you getting hit?
Well,
How are you helping?
First, I want to say I'm actually from Nebraska, so that's.
But you
that's
are guilty.
important.
You live in New York.
It's true.
All
It's
right.
a true statement.
You fled Warren Buffett. Never mind. Go ahead.
So, let me start by giving a little bit of background around what Project Leadway is and what it is that we're trying to do. Simply put, we are trying to prepare students for the global economy. But it actually gives us a little bit different approach than some of what you're hearing here. I sometimes wonder if curriculum organizations, their purpose is to try to align to the standards, or their purpose is geared more towards what we see in international PISA or assessments. And we are certainly concerned with those things as well. But because we are grounded in a global economy, our focus has been around career. One of the things that struck me in reading the frameworks document was, is there a difference between career ready and college ready? Career might be something we'd like to discuss later. Is it career and is it career or? Are they the same thing? Well, let me tell you something that we're hearing from our industry partners. What they're talking about is they're looking for students who can come to them, who can think critically, who can work in collaborative groups, and who can communicate. Now, let me unpack each of those a tiny bit. Try not to go over my time limit. When they talk about critical thinking, they're not just talking about executing procedures or routine tasks. What they're really talking about are students that can apply their knowledge flexibly, that can address novel situations in creative and innovative ways, that can think on their feet, perhaps is another way of describing that. In regards to collaboration, again, sometimes for those of us that have had to do group projects, or parents who have helped kids do group projects, what they're really talking about is collaboration is understanding the value of diversity, really understanding that people that come to the table with different experiences, knowledge, perspectives, can really add to the work that's being done. And there is also a lot of contribution in terms of being able to be creative or innovative because of those differences in approaching things in a new way. Communication, what they're interested in, isn't just reports. Isn't just students who can get up and do a PowerPoint presentation. It's really about transfer of information, but also getting information back. How do we understand things and ask questions? So it's communication that works in both ways. Now, there is some significant urgency around this. Certainly, if you're watching the news, all kinds of CEOs are describing their urgency for hiring workforce. Another source of urgency, if you've had a chance to read the Pathways to Prosperity report, what this is describing is sort of the changing field in terms of what kind of education students need. So just to give you some of the numbers, in 1973, 12% of jobs required 2 years of education. In 2007, it was 27%. In 1973, 16% of jobs required 4 years of education or more. In 2007, it was 32%. Just to give you a sense of the other end, 1973, 72% of jobs could be completed with a high school degree. That has dropped 31% to 41% of jobs requiring a high school degree. So that shifting landscape also creates a pretty dramatic sense of urgency. Economists are also talking about the consequences of income. For example, estimates now say that the difference between lifetime's earning gap between a high school degree and a college degree is $1 million. Let me talk to you about how Project Lead the Way is focusing in on preparing our students for a global economy. We focus on three things: a world-class curriculum, high-quality professional development, and partnerships. Partnerships is a very key part of what we do, and when we think about partnerships, we're thinking about people who are going to join with us in this effort. Part of this community includes 4,200 schools in all 50 states. We work in partnership with over 400,000 students, and I want to emphasize that because we learn from students every day. 16,000 teachers are a part of the Project Lead the Way community, and 48 university affiliates, in addition to corporate partners like 3M, Chevron, Lockheed Martin. For our curriculum, we have three programs: a middle school program that offers students experiences in automation and robotics, design and modeling, flight and space. We also have an engineering program in the high school as well as a biomedical sciences. The basics is this. We really try to focus our curriculum around foundational knowledge, skills, and habits of mind, and opportunities to apply those after they've built those muscles, to apply those through specialty courses and a capstone experience where students really have an opportunity to explore their own interests. Here's a point I want to make to Stephen's comment earlier, and also Dan touched on this. This isn't inquiry for inquiry's sake. Our approach to curriculum is activity, project, and problem-based with increasing levels of autonomy and complexity. You can't just say to students, go out and solve clean water problems for Haiti. They can't start there. They need opportunities to learn, bring in the science concepts, to understand the mathematics that they'll need to come up with those innovative and creative solutions. I just want to tell a quick story as we're on that. There was a school in Indiana where the students actually were able to work toward these kinds of innovative and creative solutions that we use today. The need comes from Haiti, but it also comes from places like Joplin, Missouri in disaster time. The need was shelter. And so a group of students were given the task of creating a portable disaster relief shelter. It had to be inexpensive, it had to be airlifted in, it had to solve air and water purification issues, and it also had to deal with energy source, because typically in crisis situations you lose power. So the students at Pike Central High School in Indiana created a solution that was $500 to produce with a built-in water and air purification system, renewable energy power source for LED-powered lights, and it also could be airdropped anywhere, and these are actually being used. The power of this kind of work is breathtaking, and as I said, we are inspired by our students and what they are doing every day.
Thank you very much. A couple more factoids might be helpful. Is it all in school? Is it after school? Is it out of school? Where do you do all this?
It's a great question. The programs are, well, we do have a summer Gateway Academy program for students who are moving into 6th grade, but we are implemented through schools, middle school and high school, and there's quite a variation in terms of the implementation, which we think is good. I think the flexibility allows the teachers and the schools and the districts to think, how will this work for us? And I think there's a lot of learning and buy-in and understanding that comes in that process. So in some cases, we are an elective course. In some cases, I was just speaking to a middle school teacher where we don't replace math and science, but we are still a required course. There are cases where Project Lead the Way courses do count as science credits.
But they're entire courses.
The high school is a year-long course.
Okay.
That is the design. The middle school are 9-week modules.
And the teachers who teach them are?
Again, it is a mix. So professional development is an important part of our work. And to Kate's point, this is the demands you described. We feel it as well. And the ability to teach these kinds of integrated, high-rigor, high-relevance courses is significant. So we see science and math teachers. We see CTE teachers. Again, as schools bring this program in, they're making decisions about who they would like to teach this. We also have teachers who are engineers, who are clinicians, who are now in schools teaching our curriculum.
Okay. Thank you all very much. That was terrific, and we're right on schedule besides. I want to come to an issue that's been on my mind that really Dan raised, which is why does this subject need to start young? I understand why reading needs to start young. I think I understand why math needs to start young. I don't think I understand why 3rd graders, 4th graders, 5th graders need to study or learn science. What if the whole thing started in 7th grade? My mental image of 3rd grade science is kids going around picking up leaves outside and wondering why some of them are yellow and some of them are red. Maybe I'm sure that's useful, but even for someone that's colorblind like me. But why can't this one start later as a subject for kids to learn? What's the advantage here, or the need?
Well, I'm not sure why it's transparent. If it's not transparent to you why science should start early, I'm not sure why it's transparent to you that reading and math ought to. Because the idea that there's sort of a sensitive period for these things,
No, it's
I'm
more
not
like
sure
they're
much faith I would put in
cumulative
that.
things.
Yeah.
It's more like that each grade stands on the grade below it. I'm not sure I picture how that
You
works.
could, but well, again, I don't think we need to get
All right.
into that. But I mean, to me, it's time on task, and it's how much time the kids are putting into it, and it's also a question of the communication to kids. This is something that's important. This is what school is part of. It's also the case that it provides kids another opportunity to feel that school is something I like, school is something I succeed in. One of the things that really bothers me about when you look at time on different subjects, right now in first grade classrooms, something like 2/3 of instructional time is English language arts. So if you're a kid who's dyslexic and hasn't been diagnosed yet, or just doesn't really enjoy English language arts that much, you don't have that many opportunities, other opportunities, to feel like school is a place of opportunity, of fun, that I enjoy going to. You mostly think of school 2/3 of the time when I'm being taught, I feel ashamed and frustrated. So this is another reason to have a broad curriculum early on. Is it gives kids another reason and chance to like school. Not to mention that science also supports reading, but that's another story.
Okay, Stephen, as your teams are focusing on these elementary and middle grades standards, you must have a mental image of how much of the school day or year is going to be spent on this subject. What is your mental construct here?
Well, a couple of things here. First of all, I think I would certainly echo that there's not enough time currently in the system. We know that systems at equilibrium need to have some stress for that shift to occur. And so we hope that the standards are going to help perturb the system enough to cause a little bit
Is
of
that
that.
a scientific concept that you just voiced?
It is.
Okay.
And I know I've got at least one chemist friend in the audience. And being a fellow chemist, anytime you can bring up equilibrium, you should.
We're never at equilibrium here, by the way. We're always under some kind of stress. Yes.
That's right. So part of it is, yes, we acknowledge that right now science is not being taught to a great deal in K-5 in particular, but that doesn't mean that we should keep it that way, first of all. Secondly, one of the reasons why we're making such deliberate connections between the Common Core state standards and math and language arts is also to really bring across the picture of what an education for the whole child should be. I know from just a personal anecdote, my son, had it not been for a third grade teacher who realized that he would much rather read books about reptiles and snakes and those sorts of things, would never have become the reader he is today. So we are taking a lot of effort, especially at K-5, to say not only what is developmentally appropriate for these kids, but what are natural connections that would actually buy an economy of scale of instructional time. Not that we, again, just a quick anecdote. My son came home from school after about 3 weeks, and I asked him every day, "What are you doing in science?" And he said, "Nothing."
Yeah.
And I finally one day got frustrated and said, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, today we learned about how kangaroos are marsupials, and they're related to possums, and we graphed rainfall," and he listed several things. I said, "Son, that's all science." He said, "No, that's just Australia." And what was happening is the teacher was doing a masterful job of taking a full instructional unit and integrating math, language arts, and science in a way that made sense to him as a third grader.
So my question, though, is trying to unintegrate just to get for us some sense of, are you guessing that 10% of the fourth grade should be given over to science? 20%? Give me a metric.
Well, I'm a former state education employee, so we
I
don't
know.
like to give numbers.
I know. We like to give grades.
Yes, you do. I would say at this point we have not scoped out, because we've not finished the first draft, of exactly how much time that's going to take, but we are going to be doing what I call an instructional validity check with these teachers and actually sit down and say, how much time do we think this might take? But again, and I loved how you said it and pointed it out, Our job is to put the standards in, so don't be looking for instructional materials or curriculum from us. But we are going to have a big focus that if this document doesn't have utility in the classroom, meaning that it can't be taught within the confines of the educational year, then we will have missed the mark.
Okay, carrying this primary and middle school thought over to teachers. Kate, I took your point, I assume everybody did, about high school teachers who are not typically teaching a course named science. They're typically teaching a course named biology or chemistry or physical science or something like that. Mm-hmm. But how do you picture the middle school and early grade science teacher? They are teaching something, if it's taught at all, that's called science. How do they know science? And if not, what do we have to do about that?
Typically, they have to get very little science. They maybe have to get 18 credits as a concentration, and that covers all the disciplines. So you could see that NCLB was never really enforced out there in terms of that highly qualified teachers should earn a major in the topic that they have to teach. Certainly not at the middle school level was it ever enforced. But, I want to repeat my point that it is a really tough thing to figure out how you are going to be qualified to teach four pretty distinct disciplines and have it fit into a college education. So, but I think states have done a very poor job of even coming close to some adequate compromises. Elementary teachers are probably a worse story. We go through and look at how much elementary teachers have to know in any science, and physics is completely disregarded. Is seen as totally unimportant for anything. An elementary teacher never has to take a physics course or even part of a course that devotes some time to physics. More time is spent on some biology and maybe some geology, but again, I can't emphasize enough how much the regulations and the practice in institutions, there is no rule of order here. There is no commonly accepted consensus for what elementary teachers ought to know. Therefore, one can conclude that our children who are most in need of really talented, knowledgeable teachers are probably most often getting teachers who have gotten the least amount of training in these areas. So
that's true in every subject.
That's true in every subject, so we're going to conclude it for science as well.
You just issued your organization a voluminous evaluation of state teacher policies. I don't know how close that may get to science education, but are you aware of any state that's done a particularly good job in the science teacher preparation realm that others might look at, in the same sense that Kathleen said they could look at California or D.C. for their achievement standards?
If I recall correctly, I believe Florida and Indiana both have some pretty have put forward some pretty good standards.
For teachers.
Yes, those states have been much more attentive to this problem than a lot of others. So, with the yearbook in general, we saw states improve their grades, but somewhat, not as much as maybe some states thought they might. But states have been turning their attention to evaluation. But states have yet, except for Indiana and maybe Florida, have really yet to really take on the issue of teacher preparation and what's going on in their schools of education. I would suggest that that states traditionally have been most interested in the pedagogy of teaching. So they have very prescriptive standards or coursework requirements on what teachers need to know that are contained within the School of Education. But in terms of the content preparation that teachers need, states have been relatively hands-off, which is somewhat interesting.
So, Stephen, back to you for a second. When the Common Core came out in English and Math, and I finally got a sort of hard copy I could thumb through and look at it with my own eyes. My first reaction was this is pretty rigorous and impressive. My second reaction was, how many of our teachers can do those things that are being expected of kids in the Common Core? How are you thinking about the rigor of new science standards in relation to the capacities and competencies of teachers?
Well, that's probably one of the many big hurdles that we have to deal with. First of all, it's important to always note that there are high-quality teachers out there who are doing a good job. But we also recognize that the level of shift that these standards are going to require is going to take a great deal of professional development, take a great deal of changes of mindset. So, it's a somewhat of a domino effect here. First of all, it's the real reason why you need a state-led effort. It's political reasons aside. It's also the fact that those people are going to be putting into place structures to roll the new standards out, seeking funding from their various legislatures. Partnerships have to be made between, for instance, National Science Teacher Association is gearing up to be able to help with professional development for teachers. There's a very significant move going on right now that we're working with several of our partners to start to build coalitions within the states to help identify the various individuals in those states that can help with that. I
want to interrupt because this is for any of you. Is this even within the realm of professional development? Or is this a go back and start over again with teacher preparation and learning? I mean, if you've got a 6th grade science teacher who doesn't know biology, professional development the answer to this problem?
Well, that's the typical term we use.
I know. Professional development is the last refuge of scoundrels in the field of education. It's the solution to every problem.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly if a teacher doesn't understand the content, there's going to have to be some major remediation that goes on with those teachers, or maybe even a major reteaching. But I also think that there's the recognition that you also can't stop school until that happens, right? I mean, we can't suspend school for 3 years and get every teacher in the country to be at a certain place. So that's why there's got to be this very planned rollout for how these occur. And one thing I tell people all the time is I'm cautioning the states, I'm cautioning anybody that listens to this that you have to have the courage to be patient on this. And what I mean by that is having this plan that you're going to adopt the next generation science standards and then roll them out the next fall is going to be a disaster. There's going to have to be a very planned, very orchestrated, very partnership-driven implementation plan and implementation strategy that gets the teachers to at least close to where they need to be before we can ever just assume, okay, let's pop these things in there and have a new test.
Checker, can I add something to that? There was a really fabulous paper presented at the Calder Conference last Friday that looked not at science, but at states' policies to put in algebra a year earlier. So a lot of states are they wanted 9th grade to go down to 8th grade, and the 8th grade kids had to go down to 7th grade. And, in fact, California, there's been a big buzz about their insistence on doing that. And this paper looked at an effort in Charlotte-Mecklenburg in North Carolina, as well as some other districts surrounding there that had implemented that policy.
The algebra move.
The algebra move.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what the research did, it was so fascinating. They actually produced lower results. Kids did more poorly on tests, assessments, for having taken algebra a year before they had been taking it. And sort of, what was happening here, and it's clear to me is a couple things, is that the district had put down this sort of marker or something saying this is when we should teach algebra without ever doing the work that would lead up to being able to teach algebra. So all of a sudden there was a lot of mess while they were trying to figure this out.
8th grade teachers had to be algebra teachers whether they were ready or not.
Yeah, but also the kids were coming in to take algebra all of a sudden, and they hadn't really done anything differently in K-7. So, I just think this is fascinating that districts often sort of decide that what the benchmark is that they have to meet without realizing what the work is leading up to it. And, I think if California were to look at the results from this paper, they would have to say, we don't have the evidence to go forward here. that we don't have the teacher corps that's prepared to teach algebra in 8th grade, and we certainly don't have kids who are ready to actually take it.
Dan, have you looked at the prospects of professional development dealing with basic gaps?
Not specifically in professional development, but let me offer a comment on this question. I think that the degree to which this is going to be a problem depends very much on the load that you're putting on the teacher. Put it this way, I mean, in extremis, you said, does a 9th grade teacher need to know biology? When you say know biology, like know the field in such depth that you can identify the important questions, you have in mind a sensible sequence where students should start, where students should end. Most people with a PhD don't have that. Okay, so myself and all of my friends, when we first started teaching, I was told, you're going to teach a course in cognitive psychology. All right, this is my field. I have a fancy degree in it and everything. Like, supposedly, I'm really smart and I know all this stuff, right? So, but here I am supposed to sequence it. I did what all my friends did. I got 4 textbooks out. I laid them out, and I cribbed my lectures from them. I stole the best stuff from the 4 textbooks. So that's one really extreme version of, or one endpoint of offering no guidance at all as to what's supposed to be in there, and the load is entirely on the instructor to have mastery of the field and sequence it. To the extent that you offer more and more constraints on here's the way the sequence is going to look, then what has to be inside the head of the teacher in terms of mastery of the field reduces, and the teacher focuses on other aspects of the job, clarity of communication, knowing kids, and so forth.
So, Ann, part of what you all do is produce a pre-shaped curriculum for an entire course. Is that right? Yeah. And train the teachers to deliver it. Does that work?
Yeah, what strikes me about this and what our biggest challenge has been is what Stephen referred to as changes in mindset. So, Dan, to your point, there's the content aspects of this, how it's sequenced, but it's this change of mindset, it's these habits of mind that for us have presented the steepest challenge. You can't just go in and teach a course around engineering design and solving problems and tell kids what to do. So I'll give you 2 examples of changes of habits of mind that have been a challenge for us. One is around what's the role of the teacher and the student. When you walk into a Project Lead the Way classroom, typically it's the students are working together on a particular problem. If there's a question, they ask each other. They consult with a resource that they have. It is not the teacher standing up in front telling. So that's a real shift. Related to that is sort of, I'll describe as the role of error. What does it mean to be wrong? Okay, this is another huge change of mindset, I would argue, that underlies this idea of working like a scientist. Well, what happens when you get an answer wrong? Well, if you're brave enough to raise your hand, many times what happens is sorry. I mean, the adult's reaction clearly signals you've done something wrong. In the work of science, there are opportunities, in fact, that live in error. It is all about making mistakes and learning from them and persistence. This also reminds me that you mentioned Robert Tighe's work around this idea of commitment. I mean, students' abilities to persist it lives in this idea of understanding the role of error. So one of the things that we do very concretely is adults need to experience that. And I was just at a training for our teachers, and they were programming robots essentially. And when you're doing programming, the level of detail, and I mean it's very challenging. And there were many sighs of frustration and having to get up and walk away from the computer and asking each other for help and pouring through the documents to figure out how to make, the pick-and-place robot work. For them to experience that is really powerful. And it's our belief that it helps them go back into a classroom, and when a student hits a problem, not to solve it for them or not to approach it as a way that they've done something wrong, but is to really let them think through it and take that mindset.
Good. Kathleen, I'm going to throw you a curveball. In an earlier life, you helped with curriculum and instruction in a well-regarded charter school organization. How did your well-regarded charter school organization tackle science, which is not typically part of the accountability system? It doesn't typically count much, if at all, in how the schools are evaluated. and yet you presumably thought it was important for kids to learn. What did you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at first I would say that we probably, like many schools, made the mistake of not giving it the attention it deserves, and came to learn that we suffered not just in our science achievement, but also, as Dan alluded to before, in our reading achievement, because they just didn't have the background knowledge that they needed. And so then we attacked it very similarly as some of the other content areas, which is first through developing assessments and scope and sequences. It's interesting. I feel like there are two ways you can approach them, and they're related, but they are slightly different. One is to provide teachers with a clearly day-by-day lesson curriculum that takes them from the first day of school through to the last day of school and really maps out everything that they can and should do. Another way to do it is to take the standards and to really try to define the outcomes, through assessments. How are you actually going to measure this? And I don't just mean summative end-of-year assessments, but I mean the kind of formative assessments that you need to use throughout the year, interim assessments, and both formal and informal. And getting that right really helped us shape for teachers what they then needed to do in their classrooms. And some of the onus was still on them to seek out the resources, and we had a lot of collaboration and sharing among our science teachers because there were initially fewer resources from them, and they were trying to pull things together, and we sort of slowly built up curriculum materials. But I would say that it was first and foremost outcomes and assessment driven, and then the curriculum was built in through that.
You didn't try to construct a day-by-day, here's your lesson plan for lesson 47.
Exactly. And actually the reason we didn't do that is because we had tried to do that in other core content areas, and it had really failed, frankly. Teachers kind of revolted against us and really felt like their autonomy was compromised. And obviously teacher buy-in to whatever you're doing with them and giving to them is essential. And so for us anyway, we just found that telling them here's what you have to do every day was, it was actually interesting. When we did that, we found that instruction looked more different than when we worked with them to define outcomes and have them build the curriculum more together. Then their instruction started to look more similar, which was actually interesting.
Okay, so we're in Washington. We have to talk about federal policy, at least for a minute. The NCLB mostly pushes reading and math. It's very thin on writing. It never uses the word history, and its science piece is pretty skimpy. You got to test it once in each grade, in each level of elementary, middle, and high school, as I recall. You don't have to do anything with the results. You just have to test it. And then one of the recent NCLB revision bills that recently emerged wipes out science altogether and just goes forward with reading and math. Would the country be better off, worse off, or unchanged if the next iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act treated science as equal to reading and math? Anybody?
Better.
Better. Thank you. Anybody not think that?
Next question.
All right. Anybody not think that?
Well, it depends on how you would frame it.
Okay. Badly.
Typically. But the worry, the problem with the interpretation of the reading portion of accountability is that schools have been a little bit dense about understanding what it takes to improve kids' reading scores. So if schools truly embraced the knowledge that we have that if you want kids to do better in reading, they need to learn history and they need to learn science, then you'd have much better reading instruction, a more interesting reading instruction than, Jose goes to the supermarket or whatever else they are having to read. And, I think in general you'd see much better outcomes. I know you'd see much better outcomes if we stopped teaching reading as if it were a subject, and it's not.
This is akin to an E.D. Hirsch point about why not bootleg serious content into the reading curriculum, especially if it's going to occupy half the day. And instead of Jose goes to the supermarket, maybe we get reptiles, like your kid was enjoying.
Yeah, but not. And to your point, Steve, is that I know that Hirsch has found that kids get dinosaurs every year for 5 years. Because kids love dinosaurs. Well, okay, go read about dinosaurs on your own time at some point, but dinosaurs ought to only be one year of the curriculum, not 5 years.
That's right.
Yeah, the volcanoes, right. That's a good one.
An interesting lesson, actually, potential turned up in this week's newspaper as we read that giant Burmese pythons are consuming all of the other mammals in the Everglades. There are no rabbits left in the Everglades. They've all been eaten by Burmese pythons that people in Florida have turned loose. Now, isn't there the makings there of an interesting science lesson that might absolutely rivet kids, especially if they get to watch a Burmese python eat a rabbit? Or a primary candidate? Is that what you said? Never mind. The primary was yesterday. We've moved on to some other state, which may or may not have Burmese pythons. Okay, we're going to open this conversation in just a second. Everybody in the room and in our national audience. Has our national audience figured out how to send in questions? Okay, so I don't need to go over that again. So really the last question for me, I want to circle back to something that one of you brought up, which is in the field of science, is career ready and college ready the same thing? Or are they very different things, one of which prepares you for college chemistry and one of which prepares you to work for Apple? Anybody?
Come on, Dan, a one-word answer audio. Say.
Yeah, I'm prepared, I think, on 30 seconds thought or 10 seconds thought, to defend the idea that they're probably the same thing. If there are substantive differences, I don't know what they are, and also I get pretty leery about the idea of differentiating instruction on that basis, sort of saying, you look like a career guy to me, so here, you take these courses based on my guesswork as to how I'm going to prepare you for a career, and you, on the other hand, look like so you get the idea.
Well, that's an argument against tracking.
Yeah.
Okay, but you can have voluntary choice of courses by kids, one of which...
voluntary tracking.
Voluntary tracking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's more palatable.
Stephen, are your drafters assuming, as the Common Core drafters did, that it means the same thing?
Yes, and I think the NRC, what the framework says is that the NRC is meant to be scientific literacy for all students. Now, but in that, I'll add the caveat that we are going through a process during the year of development where we are going to be in an evidence gathering mode to start to find that out. I mean, the fact is that math and language arts have had, as you pointed out earlier, have had the benefit of a lot of time of research and a lot of time of funding to have a lot of the college and career ready conversations. Science has really not had that type of conversation, and certainly at any type of national level. The core definition that started with college and career readiness of being able to go directly into a credit-bearing course in college kind of breaks down when we talk about science, because there aren't necessarily prerequisites. There aren't necessarily a course that a child could take in remediation. There are in some universities, but by and large, if I decide I want to take chemistry or rocks for jocks, I can do so. So one of the things that we are going to be doing during this year is engaging stakeholders from across the country about a conversation about what would college and career readiness really mean for science, and then what evidence base do we really have in moving forward on that.
Just circling back to Kathleen, where we began, as we did these reviews of the 50 states, I had to read them all, which was my punishment for working at Fordham. But my recollection, I want to test this on you, is that as we went through the 50 states, their approach to structuring the high school science curriculum was all over the place in terms of how they framed it, what they called it, how they organized it, what subjects it consisted of, how much was required. Is it as chaotic a picture as I'm recollecting, or were there some orderly patterns that I'm not observing?
There are some patterns. I think the requirements. I think probably, let's say most states require a basic kind of high school biology course, and a lot probably don't require much beyond that. I think the biggest chaos that you're recalling is whether or not states delineated specific standards for things like high school physics and chemistry. And there was a subset of states who merely had K-12 physical science physical science standards. And they didn't specifically say, here are the standards that students need to master in a high school physics course. And I think our reviewers felt that doing that was actually really important, that physical science and pulling together chemistry and physics and all the physical science material in one broad 9 through 12 group of standards was not good enough. It didn't get specific enough, and that at the high school level you really needed to start to separate out by discipline and by domain. And that's where states were all over the map. Only some states did that, and I think as a result only some states have the kinds of rigorous high school standards that we would want to see.
Which aligns a bit with Kate's comment about the teacher certification expectations for high school science teachers, whether they are sort of generic and nothing in particular, or whether they're actually subject specific and related to at least the traditional disciplines. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to open up for questions from the studio audience and the worldwide audience. I assume that somebody who has a worldwide question is going to bring it up to us. And yeah, go ahead. You do, however, have to identify yourself, and you do have to speak into the mic for the benefit of our worldwide audience.
I'm Rick Nelson. I used to teach chemistry. Now I go to conferences and ask first-year chemistry instructors in college this question. Why do you give so many D's, F's, and W's? Why is the failure rate so high? And they tell me almost unanimously, Rick, the kids come into first-year chemistry and can't do the math. We can't pass them. Tom Lovelace at Brookings did a study, and his numbers found that in math computation, since the state standards came in favoring use of calculators, scores in computation went way down. And computation is what we need in chemistry anyway. In math, reasoning scores went way up for students, but the professors say they grab the calculators and they can't solve the problem. So my question first for Dr. Willingham is, why did the state standards that told kids they didn't have to memorize, they could use calculators starting in third grade on the state tests, why did that fry the kids' brains in computation? And for the other panelists, if the state standards telling kids they could use calculators in third grade, if that was the problem, should we be holding teachers accountable for the results?
So you're using
fried brains.
Yeah, is that you're using the fried brains in the technical sense of the term, right? Okay, I just want to be clear on that. Extra, right? Right. So I don't think the calculators are doing anything negative in the sense that brain frying implies. What they're doing is they are ensuring that kids are not required to develop fluency in these concepts, right? So some of them are, and there are actually lots of data on this, that kids, American kids in college don't have full automaticity of math facts. Okay. The kids in the studies I'm citing don't have full. Another thing that is routinely not required in American classrooms is memorizing division tables. So American kids, when they come to a small number that requires two small numbers that should be divided, they have more or less memorized the times table, and they work backwards from that, which both takes longer and is more prone to error. But they're never asked to memorize it. And then the second piece is procedural fluency with routine procedures that need to be carried out again and again. If you rely on the calculator, those procedures become slower and more error prone.
Would anyone like to tackle the question of teacher accountability? That I believe was the second part of his question.
Well, it was more of a point than a question, wasn't it?
Do you want to restate it as a question that Kate can answer?
If it looks like the state standards that encourage calculator use, it looks like whole math and whole language were a major part of why student skills fell down. If the teachers don't have the power over those things, can you really hold them accountable like the
Can you really?
administration? Can you hold them accountable like a lot of people want to do?
Is it fair to hold teachers accountable?
We're not talking about holding teachers accountable for what happened 10 years ago, but I've still not seen it, what the...
All right. Then let's move on. Who else has a question? Besides Jerome. I know you always have a question, Jerome. Hang on a second. Hold your horses. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am, in the cowboy hat.
Yeah, Paulette Tillman. I'm a retired educator from Washington, D.C. I notice many times people say, well, we are teaching all of this math and all of this reading, and we need to have our part in it. If you recall, in 1974...
Wait. We need to have our part in it? Say that again?
People seem to want to determine which classes are important.
Okay.
And they want to give the weight to the classes that are important, which means they're taking the weight out of something else. All of these classes can be assimilated and incorporated to work together. Why is it that we don't get together with the disciplines before we put out a curriculum and determine what it is that is being done and what it is that we should do? And please don't ever have pacing charts again.
Don't ever have pacing charts.
Pacing guides, I'm sorry, pacing guides. Teach this day, this day teach this, but if they don't get this the first day, they say, well, you can't go back because you're supposed to be here.
So I think several of you suggested a kind of curricular integration here as opposed to a course-by-course separation here as both pedagogically effective and kind of a good way to get content delivered. Am I getting this right?
I mean, you may be getting it right for them, but I would argue that you run real risk of when you overly integrate something.
Okay.
Some things are discrete tasks. Learning the multiplication tables and the division tables is a discrete task in mathematics. If there's been some funny bits written about what schools have done in the name of integrating and making interdisciplinary studies. That there are, especially I think in earlier grades, there are very that you cannot divert too much from the task of learning the subject.
I think, sorry. I think sometimes I get a lot of flack because I am pro standards, but I don't necessarily think that states or potentially even districts should be mandating things like curriculum. And the reason I'm not is because I think that you can actually do both well. You can have an integrated curriculum, and you can, I think it's harder, but I think you can do that well. I think you can also teach, domain specific, and I think that's potentially slightly easier to execute, and you can do that well. And I think that from a policy standpoint, getting the standards right is critical because what you're focusing on is regardless of how you get there, here's what we want all students to know and be able to do. And I think those questions of integration or non-integration are interesting. I think they're critical, and I think that there should be some level of flexibility on the school, district, or classroom level to figure out what's the best way for a staff. Because integration requires a level of collaboration that some schools may need to work towards. And so if it was thrust upon them, they may not be ready for it.
And I would just simply say to what I was commenting on earlier, that the math that we do in the science hall shouldn't be different than the math that we do in the math hall. But there's still some math that needs to be learned and some science that needs to be learned. Mm-hmm. And the anecdote I used earlier, this wonderful teacher that my son had did end up making very clear to my kid what the science was and what the math was. But it was done in such a way that he saw a consistency across the board. And I think that's where we're coming from with the next generation science standards, is ensuring that there are connections between language arts and math, so that when you actually talk about the math in the math classroom, you don't come to my science classroom and go, excuse me, Dr. Pruitt, that looks like math up there. We're in science class. That shouldn't be. And so when I'm talking about integration, it's the consistency and the coherence, I think, that's most important.
So we have several emailed in questions from the worldwide audience. The first one I'm sure you all can knock out of the park. And it's a classic. Somebody always asks this question. It's the who is to blame question. Who or what is to blame for our low achievement? Teachers, standards writers, accountability systems, or what? I assume this applies to science. I'm going to suggest that the answer is probably all of the above, but I'd like to invite the panel to be more specific than that.
Well, I thought I was pretty clear that I blamed states, school districts, and teacher preparation programs. Certainly, I got to blame teachers. They're the victims.
Okay. Others on this? If not, we'll move right on to the next emailed question. Which discipline are we struggling the most with? I assume this means which science discipline are we struggling the most with?
Good question.
I assume that means among the major science disciplines. What's posing the greatest difficulty for your standards writers? And then I'm going to ask you what got the lowest overall marks of the strands within the standards.
For us, as we're writing the standards, we don't have a particular discipline that we're having difficulty with, mainly because we have experts from each of the disciplines, so that kind of gives us a little bit of a benefit. I will say, if you want evidence that we've not done a good job of teaching physics in this country, you can just see what happens when it rains and people are driving. You could almost make the argument that maybe driver's ed wouldn't be necessary if we taught physics better.
Or meteorology?
Or meteorology. But I think just from personal experience, I think when you get into the physical sciences, it becomes more difficult because they are not emphasized in teacher prep. And I would also put a little bit of a plug in here for earth-space science, that it's difficult because policies are usually prohibitive of us really teaching earth-space sciences past 8th grade. And I think you could make a very good argument that in today's society and in this global economy, having people who understand the dynamics of Earth systems is a very important aspect that really we need to have a better understanding of.
Okay, I don't know if you can do this on the fly or if you've tabulated it, but of the domains that our reviewers reviewed in the state standards, which came out worst and best?
So I don't have the precise numbers, but what we typically saw was high school physics and chemistry got the lowest marks, again, for a reason that I alluded to earlier, which is that a lot of states simply don't delineate specific standards for high school physics and chemistry. Physical science also tended to be among the lowest. Interestingly, life science tended to be among the highest scores.
Okay. Be an interesting. Please.
Yeah,
It would be an interesting tabulation to go back and do. Take the domains, take the point scores across the 52 sets of standards that you evaluated, and see which ones came out best and worst. Go ahead, Dan.
If we're making a pitch for where we need the most help, I would suggest engineering. Because in most districts, there's virtually no effort being made at all. And I know that at the college level, professors of engineering are very, very frustrated by this. They feel like, first of all, America is missing out on enormous potential for kids, because there are a lot of kids who would be very talented engineers and very interested who have no idea what the field is.
Can I just real quickly add to that?
Sure.
Because when I heard your question earlier, I was thinking mainly based on the traditional
high school subjects.
Right, and just to point out that the work that the framework has laid out for us and what we're working on will include engineering, because we actually do see the same aspect, that engineering in the context of science and the reliability of both, that both need each other to progress our society forward, is going to be an area that we are going to need a lot of help in going forward.
Somebody just laid on me the other day one of those classic data compilations about the nationalities of our graduate students in engineering. Was it you that sent this in? Okay. Overwhelming majority of graduate students in engineering, at least in the major leading American universities, are from other countries. They're not Americans. At least part of the reason for this is weak preparation. I'm sure there are other reasons having to do with job prospects and things like that.
23% of our double PhDs are children of our own citizens.
Say it again. 23%
of our electrical engineering PhDs.
of our electrical engineering PhDs are children of U.S. citizens.
Of all engineering disciplines, 37% go to the children of American citizens, 44%.
All right, stop. You're starting to sound like an engineer. No, I think we've got the takeaway, which is that graduate students in engineering are, for the most part, not U.S. born. And there are reasons for that, that your standards and their proper implementation are, of course, going to solve. Okay, Jerome, briefly, take him the mic. We're running out of time. No speeches. Question.
On your handout, the last item, fourth item on the bottom of the page is really great, and it needs to be seconded, because the NRC's science framework that is being implemented fits this thing of not making the link between math and science class, and it goes to great length to avoid mathematical formulas and equations. The
NRC framework avoids that link.
It avoids algebra. And in the next sentence, well, students cannot adequately learn physics and chemistry without understanding mathematical concepts and mastering quantitative equations, especially algebraic calculations and arithmetic calculations, which are quite avoided by the NRC science framework. It's clear that students taking a physics course based on that science framework will be at risk if they try to study engineering in college.
So I'm going to turn that into the question for Stephen, which is, if the NRC framework that you are using as your guide is lacking in mathematical expectations, how are your standards writers going to cope with that challenge?
Well, the NRC framework was not designed to give student outcomes. I mean, it was, here's the content from a science perspective that needs to be done. So when we go to the actual student performance expectation, that's where you're going to see the integration with the math. So our writers are hard at work in saying what math is appropriate. Again, that's why we're spending so much time with the Common Core folks, to make sure that the math that's being expected in Common Core is synonymous with what's expected in science. But the clear thing I want you to hear is it's expected in science. The performance expectations are going to be very clearly laid out of what it is that students need to be able to show proficiency in, and that will include their ability to utilize mathematics in science.
Good. Anne, just briefly, is math part of your program?
Absolutely. Yeah, in digital electronics, they're using Boolean algebra. There's trig in the computer integrated manufacturing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you cannot do the work without it.
Okay. We'll go to you, but then I've got one last question to give Stephen difficulty. Go ahead. You are the last audience question. And you are?
So I'm Danelle Hogan. I'm a high school physics teacher from Idaho and also an Einstein Educator Fellow with the Department of Energy. And my question is, a lot of the pressure seems to be on the high school science teachers to do the integration in that direction. And I'm wondering what, if anything, is being done to push some of that integration back onto the other disciplines, math, history, physical education, and move it that direction as well as into science, because it seems to be one direction from my experience.
That's a really good question. Does anybody have an answer? I don't think I know what the answer is. It's a very good point.
What should be done.
What should be done. Other subjects should integrate science into their into literature, into history of science.
And we certainly think that's true for reading.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that from our standpoint, there's a big advantage to being the second person that walks through the minefield. There's a lot that we can learn from what happened with Common Core in math and language arts. And as fantastic a job as they did, science is actually a very natural place for that integration to occur. And so it's not that math and language arts did a poor job. It's just it was a different job. And now that we're walking through the minefield second, we can say, we have a great opportunity to really show connections between math, language arts, and science, which actually makes for a much better educated citizen.
So I want to end with for you an unanswerable, but nevertheless very important question. Okay, when we reviewed the Common Core standards, which we did against the state standards in English and math, we concluded in round numbers that the Common Core standards were better than approximately 3/4 of the existing state standards and roughly equivalent to the standards of the other quarter of the states. How many states are your standards going to be better than?
Well, of course, we're pushing for them to be better than anybody's. But, we'll see how you look at it when you look at when the final draft comes out.
We promise to do that, but in a slightly more serious vein. Are you thinking let's be as good as the best of the existing state standards, better than the best? Think about it completely differently than the best? Because one of our kind of recommendations in here was, as I said earlier, Xerox California. How are you thinking about what you're doing in relation to the state standards?
Well, the 26 states that are working with us, of course, California is one of those, and based on what you have done today, you've done a very thorough evaluation of science as it stands in the United States today. Mm-hmm. The framework lays out a new vision for where we want to go in science education, and it lays out some slightly different issues that would allow us to just photocopy California. Okay. But it's important that California be at the table. It's important that California bring their knowledge and what they have done, because let's also remember that they did their standards in 1998. We've learned a lot about how kids learn science. We've learned a lot about how, from a cognitive perspective, how we can ensure that science knowledge stays past graduation. For that matter, stays past the next month. And so it's very critical that we have those states at the table, but also it's important to note that science is headed for a new era. And
even a next generation.
A next generation.
Okay.
And we're looking forward to seeing how Fordham looks at that next generation.
We can hardly wait. Why don't you all join me in thanking our panelists?
I want to correct something I said. Because of who's in the room, I made a mistake earlier when you were asking about what states stood out, and because of who's in the room, I'm especially ashamed of myself.
Go ahead.
Because Massachusetts science standards are quite good. Yeah. Well, I think I ought to public. So I named Florida, and I should have named Massachusetts.
Apology accepted. The well-oiled Fordham machine is rolling a modest reception into the room. You are all invited to partake. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, panelists, for a great job.